Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'll crack on. My name is John Riley. I'm head of business development in the PowerGen Business unit in Móna, and I'm going to talk to you this evening about the question that every CEO, I suppose, wants to know when they ask you, "Will you tell me where the company will be in 15 or 20 years' time?" And we've just been through a fairly detailed strategic review within the company, and as a result of that, we've made quite a significant announcement in terms of where the organisation is heading. And that announcement centres around the exiting of no problem, guys. That announcement sort of centres around putting a flagpole in the ground of when Móna will or expects to cease what has been the core part of our operations for nigh on 80 years, and that is the production of energy peat, or mill peat as we would call it. So I'm going to sort of paint the backdrop to why that situation has arisen, the significance of it, and maybe talk a little bit about how we see the company evolving on the road to 2030. And I think to do that, you need to understand, obviously, the landscape or the pitch upon which you're playing. And that very much relates to where energy policy is at the moment, not just anymore at a domestic level, which would have been the critical bit that Móna would have talked about when it was founded 80 years ago, but ever increasingly the European dimension and of course the global dimension in terms of energy policy. They're all having a major impact on us and how we perceive ourselves. So I'm going to talk initially a little bit about the backdrop to all of this and the reasons why we have made these specific announcements about our strategic direction. And I suppose one of the places to start with is the energy challenge as we see it in the Irish context. And interestingly, it's not necessarily at the moment about keeping the lights on. We have very significant capacity in the country and everybody knows that. The decarbonisation agenda is probably what is the core issue that's driving policy and strategy of energy companies across Europe right now and impacting those. And in the Irish context, our ability to continue to do this, which is the activity that we've been at for almost 80 years, the production of mill peat, primarily to supply the fleet of Midland peat-fired power stations. We have a lot of people telling us that we shouldn't be at this anymore for a variety of reasons. And I think as an organisation or a company, we have seen the day coming when this activity would cease for whatever reason. And back a number of years ago, we began to deal with the carbon impact or the carbon footprint impact of our activities by looking to co-fire some of our power stations with biomass. But of course, in a typically Irish way, we have lots of people telling us that we shouldn't be doing that either. So we try to get away from mill peat into something that is perceived by some as being more environmentally friendly. It's where policy is driving you, and you have a lot of people telling you shouldn't be at that either. So that's a challenge. So then we decided we would take a look at our very large land bank, much of which has become cutaway. And this is a typical picture of a cutaway peatland. This is the Mount Lucas cutaway, which would have provided energy to the state for 50 years, primarily, again, to Midland-fired power stations in the 50s and 60s, but latterly in its life it would have supplied the Crohan Briquette factory, which was located just to the northern end. And we've developed an 80 megawatt wind farm on that site quite successfully over the last number of years. But to my surprise and horror, we have a load of people telling us, in the immortal words of the Unbelievables, "Well, Jesus, you can't be doing that, lads." So then we decided we'd take a look at biogas and waste to energy projects. And as soon as you mention the word waste to energy, you have a group of people who tell you, "Well, Jesus, you can't be at that." And interestingly, in the middle of this journey over the last decade or so, we did look and eventually were successful in achieving planning permission for what is recognised as the most efficient and environmentally friendly form of electricity generation on the fossil side, which is CCGT. We went through a protracted planning process to get planning permission for a 600 megawatt campus. And again, during that process, we had lots of people telling us, "Well, you can't be at that either." So one of the backdrops that we have as an energy company is the fact that almost no matter which way you turn, people are saying, well, I wouldn't be doing that if I were you. But I suppose from our perspective, we have to be very, very conscious and cognizant of the fact that, you know, when you're trying as a utility company or as an energy company to assess your strategic direction, you know, you've got to try to bring people with you. And it is extremely difficult in the current environment to do that. As I said, we've had experience of a whole range of different generation types, and we've had plenty of people tell us each time, well, you can't be doing that. Now, I wonder, though, was it ever any other way? Because energy infrastructure by its very nature is not a very popular piece, and everybody knows and wants to have the lights on and wants to have energy at the flick of a switch. But in general, people don't want to be living anywhere near energy infrastructure. So that's a critical backdrop to what we're at strategically. And, you know, from the perspective of electricity generation, that's our forecast of what 2015 will eventually look like. The 2014 figures were published by SEAI recently, and I don't think things are going to change dramatically in the year, except to say that probably the onward march of renewables is very evident. This has been quite a good wind year, and we estimate that wind's contribution to Ireland's energy mix on the electricity side in 2015 is likely to bounce out around 22%. Whether you get a good or bad December will dictate exactly where it lands. Gas will remain the dominant fuel at 44%, and coal and peat, the fossils, the intensive fossils sitting here. Biomass beginning to make a splash. Within that category there, you have biogases and other types of materials that are broadly classified as biomass. Imports sitting at about 5% and hydro at about 2%. That obviously leaves Ireland, from an electricity generation perspective, about 68% import dependent, which is a significant improvement from where we would have been even a decade ago. And the bulk of that import would be from the UK. So in terms of security of supply, we're probably not in a bad position. Bord na Móna's view of what 2020 will look like is something like that. I think we'd be in broad agreement with most people around the shape of the thing. But what's becoming very clear to us as an organisation, in terms of policy and market forces, you can see the carbon intensive fossils beginning to get squeezed on the power system. What ultimately will dictate the level of squeeze that comes from the continued growth of renewables will be market forces, where carbon prices sit, where gas prices sit. They will be the critical elements that will ultimately determine the breakdown there. Our view in Bord na Móna is that the 2020 RES-E target of 40% is probably still up for grabs. We wouldn't certainly see it taken as a given that it will be achieved. I think there's still a way to go with the 40%. And of course, in relation to the overall 16%, I don't think there's a ghost chance in hell of Ireland meeting that particular target when you take heating and transport into account. What's driving all of this, as I've said, is the decarbonisation agenda. And I do like to look at this and contemplate this slide, because this is a slide that I'm sure is well known to most people here. It's the 2050 low carbon roadmap produced by the European Commission. What I always say to people, you need to notice a couple of things here. First of all, the only sector that is asked to completely decarbonise, almost completely decarbonise effectively, is electricity. You need to be making progress in that regard. And of course, decarbonisation on the electricity side will allow Europe to use electricity as a low carbon vector to deal with sectors such as heating and transport, which are proving, as we now know, very, very difficult to decarbonise. In terms of the policy piece, the 20% RES target will, as we see it, deliver about need to be delivered by about a 35% RES-E target at a European level. In terms of the emerging picture for 2030, that will need to see RES-E across Europe hitting about 45% if we're to meet the trajectory of this roadmap. It won't be an even 45% across Europe. One imagines and one hopes that this time around, Europe will deploy renewables and the type of renewables where it's most cost effective to do so. And in that context, you try to imagine what Ireland's RES-E target or quasi-target might look like in terms of 2030. It's probably likely to be, ultimately, I believe, it will rest north of that figure there because of the resource that we have. But the message in all of that for Bord na Móna is that our view centrally of what 2030 might look like is something like this. And this is a rather ambitious 55% RESI contribution from the electricity sector in Ireland. And we believe it will need to be something close to that in terms of Ireland assisting with and dealing with the challenges that it has in the transport and heating sectors, for example. Though there's a long way to go on that. So we think that obviously wind, as the most cost-effective renewable, will dominate. There'll be biomass at ever increasingly, but not 20, 15, 20, 30%. You're not going to get to anything near that. Solar may make an appearance. Let's wait and see. We'd probably be a net exporter of electricity in this scenario by 2030, in our view. And ultimately, the coal and gas switching here will be determined, as I said, by market forces, carbon pricing in particular, and the pricing of the two fuels, the two commodities. What you clearly see here, from Bord na Móna's perspective, is we don't see peat in the generation mix by 2030. And that's a fact. The primary reason for that will be the market and market forces. That will ultimately make it uneconomical to continue to generate electricity from peat. It will have to stand on its own 2 feet in the intervening period, and the market will ultimately dictate when the activity ceases. That's a reality that we as a company have to face and that we are facing up to. These are the pieces, as I said, the game changer for us is carbon pricing. I'd have to admit that if I were to go back, Bord na Móna bought its first ton of carbon in 2005. If I was to go back that far and someone were to say to me that I could be buying carbon today at 8 and 9 euros a ton, I would have said no way. We've bought it at 30 euros a ton. As we all know, there has been some challenges around the EU ETS and its effectiveness. But I think at the end of the day, that pricing mechanism will ultimately be got right, and it will ultimately see fossils squeezed out of the market. Governments don't have to take decisions on what fuels are in and out. Let the market decide. Let the market dictate. That's the way it should be. This particular piece has an impact not just on energy peat, but also on some of the other activities that we're at, as I'll show you in a moment, in terms of our heating. The heating products, we are the biggest supplier of solid fuels to the domestic heating market in Ireland. And again, carbon taxation will ultimately drive those types of products out of the marketplace. So that's sort of a backdrop to where we're at. Again, I don't think there's anything surprising there for people. The critical thing is, what have we been doing about this? We have actually, as an organization, been looking and staring at this day for quite some time. And we have begun a process of transformation over a decade ago. Because if you went back to 2000, that's primarily what Bord na Móna was at. Milling peat, manufacturing a range of solid fuels, the good old peat briquette. We had at that stage got right into the solid fuel market in terms of the range of products we supplied. We were supplying coal. We're the biggest supplier of coal to the domestic heating market. And a range of other convenience products that sat in around that for the home heating market. That's a big, big activity for us. The other thing that we were doing is Irish horticultural peat is recognized by professional growers across the world. We're exporting product to the UK, we're exporting product to the Middle East and the Far East because horticultural peat is recognized as a quality product. So long as the market wants that quality product and we can provide it, that's what we will do. But the realization that these types of activities will ultimately come to an end directed Bord na Móna over a decade ago to seek to transfer itself from a sole reliance on peat and peat harvesting into other related activities. And two such big leaps that we made is we went up the value chain in terms of electricity generation by acquiring the Edenderry peat-fired power station as it was in the day. 100% peat-fired when Bord na Móna got a hold of it. Now it's been co-fired with up to 40% biomass in response to policy. And of course, we have expanded our fleet of generation capacity almost entirely with a focus on renewables or the types of plant that will ultimately support renewable deployment, because that's what market and policy was telling us. The other area of diversification for us was into waste and waste management. and we would have acquired the AES brand and business back in 2007. And that complemented our engineered landfill that was under development at Drogheda in County Kildare. So we're now a sort of a fully integrated player in the waste segment, in the waste market. So that transformation, that response from the company has been ongoing in recognition of the ultimate decline of peat harvesting, has been ongoing for well over a decade and will continue. So on that basis, some key facts that people may not be aware of about our business today. Last year, the last full financial year, for the first time, the company had over 50% of its turnover coming from non-peat related businesses. And that was a key target for us in terms of the diversification agenda that was started over a decade ago. That's not saying good night to peat today. We can't just shut it down overnight, but a clear recognition of the fact that it's on a gradual transition to being phased out. We will still supply peat briquettes for as long as the market wants that, but the recognition is that the end of the peat briquette will come at some stage in the next 15, 20 years. Last year, as I said, we used over 280,000 tonnes of biomass across our businesses. It's not just for power generation. We're using them in the manufacture and supply of various forms of renewable heating products whose market position is growing. And we're pretty sure, we're the biggest users of biomass in the state right now. We own over 80,000 hectares of land. That's almost 200,000 acres. And as custodians of that land, as you'll see in a moment, our strategy is very much about what we're going to do with that land as we phase out of mill peat production. We're not just going to walk away from it and say, there you are. We have plans in relation to how we can use that land. From the horticultural perspective, another very interesting fact is we are the largest bulk exporter of product off the island in terms of our professional bulk peat. It's a very, very big export. And our waste collection business, our AES business, has grown to over 100,000 customers, which was a key benchmark for us, a key performance indicator for us when we set out to diversify into that particular sector. So very, very much a company that's in transition and in change. And we look to companies like Nokia, for example, maybe not the best example in the world, but Nokia did start out as a logging company. It made paper and it made toilet rolls, and it ended up making phones. Now, I'm not saying that Móna is going to end up making phones or cars or who knows, but the fact is transformation and strategy has to be continuously reviewed. And the key thing is it's got to be dictated by market and market forces and policy. So let's come back for a minute to peat-fired electricity generation, the core activity that we were set up to do. And talk about the role of policy. I'm with the company 8 years, and it's very interesting when you're out on the stomp trying to get planning permission and engaging with communities and various fora. A lot of people tell us your policy is wrong. You're following the wrong policy. We have to remind people that we don't set policy. Móna has no more of a role in setting energy policy than my two kids at home have. We've the same role as anybody else in terms of when consultations around policy and policy direction arise, we participate in that. And as a majority state-owned entity, our remit requires us to follow policy, but not blindly. Not blindly. And that is what we attempt to do. But the role of policy is critical to organizations like Móna. Because if you go back to why this whole thing started, it started back in the 1930s when Ireland was having real trouble meeting its own energy needs and demands, and employment in the early days of the state was a real problem. So a decision was made to try to exploit commercially. Let's use that word. That was the original memos and arts of the company. Exploit commercially a portion of the peatlands in Ireland. We only own and manage about 8%. We're not the largest owner of peatlands in the country. Everything that happens on peatlands, we get blamed for it. But the fact is, we're only the custodians of 8% of that peatland. And in the 1960s and 1970s, when I was a little boy, peat obviously played a very, very dominant role in electricity generation. And what's interesting about these sorts of figures is that if you look at 1964, Ireland imported 35% of its needs to meet electricity demand at the time. In other words, we were self-sufficient to the tune of 65%, which is a lot better than we are today. And peat played a very, very significant role in that. As the economy grew into the 70s, most of the new capacity was oil-fired because oil was cheap. And I'm not old enough to remember really the first oil crisis, but I do remember, and from my history and following from an energy policy perspective, it was a shuddering time for Ireland in terms of its energy policy and where it was to proceed. But peat was playing a relatively significant role, and the decision was made at that time to push on with the role that peat was playing in the energy mix. I could produce papers and documents, anybody could, in the late 60s, early 70s, where people were saying peat production will be over in 10 years. Oil is so cheap, what the heck? These things happen. These things happen. So a decision was certainly made at that time to ramp up the contribution of peat, especially in the electricity sector. And with the result that, you know, if you look at the chart of peat production volumes, the heyday of peat production for energy was probably in the 80s, the late 80s and the early 90s. You had 6 peat-fired power stations on the system. And at that time, Bord na Móna's mill peat production was peaking at around 6 million tonnes of material a year, all driven by policy. There is absolutely no doubt that the other component of the policy piece was employment, because the vast majority of these peatlands are located in the Midlands, where at the time employment was particularly, the employment situation was particularly difficult. And the contribution that Bord na Móna has played to the economy in the Midlands is absolutely crucial. And the announcement that we've made recently is every bit as much about letting people know, particularly in the Midlands, that this activity is on a wind down now, and we need to prepare for that. We don't want to be telling them about that in 2025 when the gates are shut in 2026. The Midlands economy needs to prepare for a time when the level of employment that the company is giving today simply doesn't exist anymore. And again, from a social perspective, no matter what people are saying about it, we can't shut that off overnight. And it's not our intention to. But we see a gradual decline and transition managed properly as the best way forward. That's the situation that existed in the late 90s, which was another sort of a watershed period for peat production, because Ireland in the late 90s was a very, very different place to Ireland of the early 70s. And the question would again have arisen, what role does peat have to play in the energy mix? And crucially, in terms of employment. And a core decision was made that it needed to continue. And again, if you look at the PSO decision from Brussels that supported that, the crucial thing that tipped that was not the security of supply, it was employment. That was the decision that allowed state aid clearance, the primary decision that allowed state aid clearance for PSO support to allow that to continue. Now, there are many people who say you should never confuse employment policy with energy policy. From a personal perspective, I have to say I believe they're right. But I didn't set the policy. So a decision was made in the late 90s to continue with peat in the fuel mix for a variety of different policy reasons. And even though we saw the Cahersiveen station close, Allen Wood Power Station close, Port Arlington close, Eden Derry Power Station came along as a new generation of peat-fired power stations. It was opened in 2000. It's entering its it's just completing its 15th year of operation. And at that time, the decision, you also had the closure of the Bellacoric Power Station in Mayo and of the Road Power Station just down the road, if you excuse the pun. And the decision was, again, as part of that whole policy piece, was made to replace the 2 old peat-fired power stations at Lanesborough and County Roscommon, Longford, and the Roscommon-Longford border, with a new generation plant owned by the ESB, and also to replace the Shannon Bridge Power Station with a new bubbling or circulating fluidized bed facility. So policy decisions critical to the ongoing production of milled peat to service these power stations. These power stations at full tilt were using about 3 million tonnes of milled peat annually. So along with other requirements for milled peat on the horticulture and the fuel side, we would have seen over the last number of years sales topping out at around, or production topping out at around 4 million tonnes. But even with all of that, you know, electricity demand has doubled on the power system since 1990. And you can see how things have changed in terms of peat's role, the brown bit here, how its role has changed and how we see it changing. The message is clear. You know, peat in the energy mix is declining and will continue to decline. And ultimately, there is no question of any further support. I think even if the Irish government wanted to grant us support, and we battered at that door, and why wouldn't we? Getting it through Brussels in the current environment with COP21 out there and the whole climate change agenda, it just wouldn't happen. So we have to attempt to make peat to stand on its own 2 feet, and we will do that. We will restructure ourselves and reorganize ourselves to give milled peat the best chance of staying in the market commercially. And why shouldn't we? But we accept that that market will ultimately close that business and close that operation in due course. So on the basis of that and our assessment of the market, we expect to see peat production, energy peat production decline. You know, that's a very sort of a linear approach, but it'll be something like that. This year we produced 3.6 million tonnes of energy peat. By 2020, we'll be down to 3 or below it. And, you know, how long will that activity continue in the next decade will be dictated purely by market forces. It's as simple as that. So having accepted that position, it was relatively easy for us to say that peat production will finish at a point in time. Where the 2030 figure came from was that in stock, in terms of our production capabilities, with bogs that are currently in production, there's about 45 million tonnes of peat available. And we made a commitment a number of years ago. We were not opening. We have ceased the opening of new bogs, the preparation of new bogs. It takes a number of years to prepare a bog for production. So that's it. When that material is gone, it's gone. But we as an organisation believe that the best thing to do with that material is to take it out in a commercial manner and then to look at the after use of that land in the way that we have successfully done with a number of sites that have already come out of production in the last 15, 20, 25 years. So our land bank, and that's a picture of it there, it's just again to show you that represents about 8% of the total peatlands in the country. And they're the sites that are primarily in production, concentrated mainly around the Saucer in the Midlands here. But our land bank remains one of our key assets. And I suppose as a company and executives within the company or management within the company, we could sit down and strategically decide, well, look, that's it. The game is up. This activity that we've been at for 80 years is about to end or will end in due course, and we should just shut up the gates. But we're not going to do that. We're going to try to transform the company and use the asset base that it has, particularly in its land assets, to try to drive continued value for the shareholder and for the state. That's the job we are asked to do. So in terms of the sorts of activities that we're at, and going back to the energy piece, this is a picture of the Brucana wind farm, which is on the county boundaries of Kilkenny, Laois and Tipperary. The three counties meet somewhere about here, which is the location of the substation on the site. And you can see the sort of state that a cutaway ends up in, the difference between this part here, which is clearly cutaway, and these areas here with the deeper brown colour, which are active peat production areas. There's a wind farm operating happily. You know, Nick's here in the audience. There's probably a little bit of tension at the time between ourselves, the guys who were building the wind farm, and our colleagues, of course, in feedstock, but they were all managed. You can happily develop these types of activities hand in hand. And obviously, when these areas here come out of production, as they will in the next few years, the opportunity perhaps to extend that wind farm, for example, will clearly be there. That picture was taken in the wintertime, by the way. We did think early on that we might be able to reflood some of these areas and get the offshore tariff for wind, but that idea fell foul of the regulator. So looking at the land base, obviously the potential to continue to develop renewable energy projects of scale to contribute to the decarbonisation of the power system is a real option for us, and one that we will continue to pursue in the right areas. Not every piece of cutaway will be suitable for large-scale developments such as this, but I think what you can see from this picture is the relatively remote location of this site. And when you're standing in the middle of them, you know, the nearest residences or dwelling houses are quite some distance away, which obviously helps in terms of your ability to operate successfully plants of this type without disturbing our neighbours, which is a core issue for us. We don't want to be doing anything that impacts negatively on the communities in which we have operated for 80 years. We haven't always had great relationships with our neighbours, because milling peat by its very nature can be a challenging activity in terms of managing the environmental consequences of it. So we've had to deal with that with local communities and neighbours for years, and we will continue to do that as we move forward. So on the basis of that, our continued expansion of our PowerGen business is a real key strategic focus for us. So continuing to move forward in terms of electricity generation. This year, we will produce about 1.2 terawatt hours of electricity. So we're not an ESB or nowhere near it, but that's quite significant. And from a standing start a number of years ago, it represents solid progress for us. Going forward, obviously, we think that wind will continue to play a role. So will biomass in terms of power generation and specifically heating, as I'll show you in a moment. And who knows, maybe in time, solar will come to Ireland. And if it does, and we can develop it at scale, there is absolutely no doubt that our land bank would be particularly suitable for this type of activity at scale. And perhaps co-locating wind with solar, and there are some challenges around that, thereby optimizing the grid assets that are clearly developed and have been developed around some of these wind projects. And I think clearly as an organisation and as a country, Ireland needs to bite the waste to energy bullet. It's very difficult, it's very challenging, but there are opportunities out there in terms of resourceful use of waste to contribute to decarbonisation, provide very cost-effective and sustainable waste management solutions that have as an added benefit the production of renewable energy. That's a picture of our landfill gas, 5 megawatt landfill gas project operating successfully at our landfill in Drogheda. And I think we have a much bigger focus now on biogas and various types of syngas production and how they can be incorporated into our fleet. So by 2021, that's roughly speaking what we would see. We would see ourselves contributing about 2 terawatt hours of generation to the electric power system. And, you know, it may look something like that. Crucially, and this is a key performance indicator for us, a KPI, every year we want to see an increase in the renewable portion of what we do, a decrease in the fossil element, and a significant decrease in the carbon intensity of the electricity we produce. This year, 2015, over 50% of the electricity we produce from our portfolio will be renewable. Again, another very important milestone for the company. As I've always said, Borden Móna doesn't have a carbon footprint, it has a carbon jackboot. And we can't deal with that overnight. Or dealing with it overnight and kicking 2,000 people onto the dole is not a sustainable way of dealing with things. We need to transition out of it in a sustainable and a manner which has the least impact on those people that we have served for years, our employees, and the communities in which we operate. So that's a key target for us, and that trajectory will continue out to 2030, where I'm pretty sure this portion of the graph will have disappeared, and the fossil element of what we're doing will be 1 or 2% in terms of flexible gas capacity. The rest of it will be renewable. that's the progress we've made in terms of reducing the carbon intensity of what we do. The blue line is the significant progress that's been made from a policy perspective in reducing the carbon emissions intensity of the Irish electric power system. And we're already beginning to see the benefits of that from an economic perspective in terms of the attractive location that Ireland is and Irish power systems are to multinational companies. From a corporate social responsibility perspective, companies ever increasingly want to use more and more renewable electricity. So we want to contribute to the ongoing decline of the emissions intensity of our electric power system. In terms of the other bits and pieces that we're at, as I've said, our resourceful use of waste and waste streams will be critical to the company's future. That's a picture of a cell, fully lined and engineered landfill down in Drogheda in County Kildare. But we want to move ever increasingly to diverting the material we're putting into landfill and use it in a resourceful way. So we're focusing on back-end treatments, enhanced back-end treatments like mechanical biological treatment, the ongoing separation. At our front end, by the way, the AES business very successfully has integrated source segregation in its domestic collection piece. And pushing that on through to segregating out the various elements of the waste stream into things that can be reused is a key focus for the company. But of course, it has to work commercially. And ultimately, through mechanical biological treatment, for example, looking at producing refuse-derived fuels or materials that can be used in energy production, with a focus where we can on CHPs. We have 2 large CHPs within our own fleet right now at our briquette manufacturing plants, which need to be upgraded. And we will focus on that right now. And again, we want to be powering those facilities with more renewable fuels. And whether waste-derived fuels, and sometimes it's hard to say that, isn't it? But we have to be grown up in Ireland. The great thing is that Carnstown has come along, and Poolbeg will come along, and no one will have died. And we will be standing up to our responsibilities as a nation in terms of treating our own wastes. We're still exporting far too much. We export, let somebody else deal with it. The Board of Móna as an organisation has got to stand up and start to drive this strategically in terms of providing sustainable and well-managed waste solutions for the country. And I think we have a role to play in that. We're already doing it to a certain level and we need to push on with that. In terms of renewable heating, and there is no doubt that in terms of the decarbonisation agenda, heating and transport provides an enormous challenge for Ireland. We've seen the Taoiseach out in Paris saying, well, lads, we just need a bit of time to sort this out. And he's absolutely correct. Agricultural emissions, we have a totally different emissions profile to anybody else in Europe. We're producing, I can't remember, is it 5 or 6 times the amount of food we consume? We are a food producer. We're damn good at it. We do it in a very sustainable way. The solution to agricultural emissions is not to stop doing it here and do it in a more emissions intensive way somewhere else. But we need to step up to the plate in terms of dealing with other elements of our economy where we can. And heating undoubtedly is a space and an area where we would see Bord na Móna making a contribution to that decarbonisation agenda. Thanks to this little guy, the stove. Again, I'll go back 10 or 15 years ago and I can pull out strategic reports in Bord na Móna that says the day of the briquette, it's over. Open fireplaces will be gone and no one will be using them anymore. It's a quality product and people still use them and like to use them. And while that market is still there and we can provide them at a price point within that market, we will do so. But we clearly recognise that through carbon taxation and policy measures, there is an ever increasing shift to renewable types of home heating. But again, the Irish consumer is very savvy and they will demand quality products. It's not just a case of cutting down the tree outside and letting it sort of dry kind of half and then putting it into the fire. That's not going to achieve anything. So we need, and we are looking very, very closely at the shift in the marketplace, the opportunities that are provided by this little stove guy in terms of driving renewable heating products, such as kiln-dried logs, a range of different types of biomass type fuels that you can use very conveniently in these stoves, and even The use of this, lad. And that's a biomass briquette, by the way. Biomass briquette. Now, it's not just as easy to produce as a peat briquette, but we can make it look like we've done some trials with this. People didn't like it looking like a biomass briquette. So we may have to sort of colour it a little bit to make it look like a peat briquette. We have been accused by people who say that's not biomass, it's peat. And even if it's a 50-50 mix, isn't that progress? That's what we have to be about. So there is no doubt that if we want to stay in this game, on the heating side, we have to ensure that we provide the marketplace with the types of products that will allow us to shift from fossil fuels into more renewable forms of heating. Electric heating too will have a role, there is no doubt. But I think in the context of rural Ireland, we're still going to see, and we've built some big houses in Ireland. Space heating is a challenge. Electric space heating is a big challenge. So the need for these types of things will continue. It's a matter of pushing renewable heating products through into the marketplace and heating products that people can rely on. So biomass will be very, very central to our sustainability agenda as a country. And how we use that biomass and generating biomass supply chains is a challenge. We've been pushing the energy crop piece. It's had many, many challenges. We've been using materials ex-forest through waste materials from sawmills. We've been getting involved in the thinning activities of pulpwood production, and obviously imports. If biomass is to play a role in Ireland, in whatever shape or form, if it's to be meaningful, imports will have to be part of the solution. People say to me, well, that's not sustainable. Well, look, we either try to replace coal with imported biomass, or we just say, look, there is no alternative. That's our view. And we will continue to pursue that agenda with a mix of indigenous and imported materials. And obviously, our focus will be on trying to drive the absolute maximum from the indigenous sector through private forestry and a properly funded energy crop program, which in our view has potential to be game-changing from the perspective of heating. Using that material in our power plants, displacing peat over time, and obviously in terms of the CHP facilities that we have to replace at briquette manufacturing processes, this is the sort of thing we're at today, producing peat briquettes. We need to shift that to producing a range of biomass-based heating products, while optimizing the amount of electricity, renewable electricity you can produce for the electric power system. So that's effectively where the organization is going. And as I said to you, going back to the land-based piece, the possibility of co-locating other forms of renewables or kit that facilitates renewable penetration onto the electric power system, where it needs land, it's something that we believe we can provide. And land that's quite well served in terms of its location, in terms of grid infrastructure and access with roads and things like that. So, the future, as I've said, may look something like this in terms of our land base, that if solar comes to town in a way that's commercial, the possibility of co-locating that on our lands with existing wind farms, and perhaps incorporating storage, though it might look a little bit more sophisticated, these things will require land. And that's the sort of activity that we would see Bord na Móna increasingly pursuing over the course of the next 15 years or so, as we gradually transition from a company that had a sole reliance on energy peak production.
So we'll open the floor to questions. So we'd just like people to state your name and organisation, and if you could use the microphone for the benefit of the people who are participating by webcast. So we'll open the floor for the first question.
Ian Lumley with Untitled. Bord na Móna was, of course, a great innovator in his time in the mid-20th century and filled a major a national need in World War II and the decades after. So can Bord na Móna be a great innovator again? Can it instead of what I would describe as prolonging the agony until 2030, which is basically extracting the 45 million tons of peat that you have still capable of being taken out of your active bogs, come up with a much more ambitious exit strategy for peat when carbon pricing is going to be much more expensive. Obviously, in the next decade, if we're going to have a successful climate agreement, and even if it isn't, even if we have an ineffective market because of politicians chickening out on taking effective global action, surely Ireland and a state company owned by Ireland should be taking leadership. And is there any way of accelerating that rather than waiting too long? In other words, a more speedy exit strategy for peat.
I mean, thanks for that, Ian. And I suppose we would consider that we are being quite innovative. What's interesting in this sort of discussion is that you have your view that we're not doing things quickly enough. We have a whole other constituency who are horrified that we are thinking about doing it at all. And I go back to my point in the beginning. We have a range of different stakeholders that have to be looked at here. And the role that Bord na Móna has played in the Midlands in terms of employment is important. And how we deal with that issue is crucial to all of this. Just pulling up stumps overnight is something that, first of all, I don't think, frankly, if we said we were going to do it, I don't think we'd be allowed. I think we have to transition gradually out of this. And my view is, Ian, we have been transitioning gradually out of this. We could happily have been burning 1 million tonnes of peat at Edenderry Power Station for the last 8 years. But we've tried to progressively move forward in decarbonising the activities of that power station. And yet people, such as yourselves, have said to us we shouldn't be using biomass either. So I think we will continue to be innovative in terms of how we exit this and exit it in a way that takes on board the view of the wide range of stakeholders that we have to answer to. And our employees are vitally important to the company, but so are the communities that depend on the existence of Bord na Móna in the Midlands. It's not something that we can do overnight. But we're very, very clear here that we're not expecting any wizard to come over the hill and offer us a way to continue to do this. The market will dictate ultimately, as it should, when fossils are phased out. And I think where I would agree on the climate piece is, you know, we in Ireland didn't start the fire, that's for sure. We absolutely have a role to play in accelerating the decarbonisation of our economy, but we need to be careful not to do it at a pace that damages the economy when others really, Ian, and I've said this to you several times in discussions we've had, I've been listening about a global climate change deal for a decade, and it hasn't arrived. Now, let's hope that it does arrive this time in Paris, and that we all get clarity, and that everybody is going to take responsibility for doing what needs to be done. I think in that scenario, Ian, Ireland won't be found wanting in terms of its ability to decarbonise its economy, and Bord na Móna certainly won't be found wanting in terms of contributing to that. But let's wait and see what COP21 brings.
Hey John, Bernice Doyle from SC Renewables. Just fascinating to see the evolution of Bord na Móna over the last decade and decarbonisation. But do you think ultimately it's the best value for the state in terms of the state we're at now, where we have 3 semi-state companies effectively vying for energy projects, particularly in the renewable space? Is the best way to go about it?
Well, again, I've never understood that particular argument. I mean, we're not vying with each other for projects. I mean, we're developing renewable energy projects on our own land, effectively. You know, there's not a competitive element, and there hasn't been, to development of renewable projects, except really in relation to land and the ability to acquire land. So if a competitive process arises for in future for support mechanisms or whatever is out there, then I think that may have to be looked at. But again, I don't necessarily see a problem with, Ireland has always held up the New Zealand model And I speak as somebody who worked for Eon, a company that came into Ireland and had a look and exited. And the primary reason was the market size. There were other reasons, but the market size was a critical one. Now SSE have come in and been a breath of fresh air in the Irish market and have stayed, and there's an obvious commitment to stay, which is a really positive thing. But I think in terms of looking at competition across the market and competition, the government has decided it needs to have the state-owned enterprises part of that competing mix, which is exactly the model that was pursued in New Zealand. So from our perspective, I don't think it's a major problem. But it really depends on where the policy piece is likely to bring us going forward. And a lot of that, I suspect, will be dictated by what sort of support schemes or state aid is required for support schemes going forward. Maybe in a competitive environment that would need to be looked at.
Jerry Duggan, Energy and Environment Division. Firstly, thank you for a very excellent lecture. Apologies that you were left to start it.
No problem.
Looking at that graph there, the standard EU one, showing the electricity sector being totally carbon free by 2050. I mean, this myth has been going around for a rather long time. The reality is the technology is not there to permit that to happen. Mm-hmm. Wind, okay, peaks during winter, and solar would be a good complement to it in that respect. And by 2025, solar may well be competitive even in the Irish environment. But even if you put the two of them together, you know very well that you're going to require a significant amount of thermal generation. Mm-hmm. And the reality is carbon capture and storage is virtually dead. The one post-combustion project that was done, the Boundary Down project in Canada, cost €1 billion for a 110 megawatt power station. It's not possible to conceive of it, and this is why the British dropped their proposed $1 billion funding for it recently. The difficulty with these technologies is it also makes it difficult to complement even with nuclear, because these demand being complemented by a low load factor thermal output, which is not what a nuclear station should be. So my question is, in the Irish context, biomass looks about the only complement that you can see to that type of thing, because storage will, 8 hours is probably 24 is certainly the limit of storage. And I think biomass is going to have to play a much larger role in the Irish context. And I think, the work you've done has been very helpful in that regard. And I would just like to see a recognition that we are going to have to expand our biomass use quite substantially if we are to get anywhere near getting down to zero emissions electricity market.
Thanks, Jerry. And look, I think you've summed up really well the enormous challenge there is there, because I have to say, as somebody who's worked for 20 years in the sector, and there are people here with a little bit more experience than me in that regard, if somebody was to give us a blank piece of paper and tell us how we are going to achieve that, I won't go back to the roadmap, I don't think I could do it. I absolutely agree with you. The technologies certainly are not there today. The great hope, of course, is that we'll be using technologies that aren't around today. Now, I caution that, because what this slide was designed to show was how much or how little the power sector has actually changed or will actually change in the 30 years from 1990 to 2020. And that's in spite of the fact that there's been a considerable policy piece driving this change for almost 15 to 20 years of that 30-year period. And yet, we still see gas in the mix, we still see coal in the mix, we still see peat in the mix. Obviously, wind has come in, but there hasn't been a dramatic change in the way we do things. And you're absolutely correct. The CCS piece was something that Europe, I'm quite active at Euroelectric level, and if I go back a decade ago, the big power companies in Europe saw CCS as the solution to the decarbonisation agenda. And you're absolutely correct. It simply is not moving in the direction or at a pace that could see you having confidence that it can deliver and contribute to that zero carbon piece by 2050. So we agree. What else is out there from a thermal perspective other than biomass? And if we don't, as a country, grapple with that challenge, it's very, very hard to see how we can meet that sort of a roadmap trajectory in Ireland. Absolutely, it is practically impossible. So that's why we will continue to pursue that agenda. You know, again, market forces will ultimately dictate how successful that is. But I think if we cannot, I don't think there's any hope. And I say this from a broader European perspective. If we can the biomass piece, Europe has no hope, in my view, of hitting that trajectory that is crucial to achieving an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions across the European-wide economy.
So John, Donald Kissan, Gas Networks Ireland and the Energy and Environment Division. I suppose following on from Jerry's comment there on biomass, I mean, biomass has fallen into, I won't say disrepute, but the withdrawal of subsidies, and Drax is in trouble in the UK. You know, is there not a role for, or an increased role for biogas rather than solid biomass? And given that the Irish agricultural sector is going to be producing a lot more methane, which is one of the, I suppose, hardest greenhouse gases to mitigate. But when used as a fuel, it's natural gas.
Sure.
Your comments
Yeah,
on that?
I absolutely agree, Donald. And I think, you know, gas, the wind to gas piece, in terms of injecting an ever increasing proportion of syngases into the natural gas network, you know, these are all things that I think we in Ireland have got to look at very, very seriously. I do caution sometimes, though, when you think of, and there's absolutely no doubt that in terms of biogas production, you know, we're not doing enough of it in Ireland. And considering the very, very successful agri-food sector we have and agri-production sector we have, the fact that we're still dealing with most of that waste by simply land spreading it, rather than dealing with it in a more sustainable way, and capturing the renewable energy component from that, it's disappointing. But there are two challenges around that. It goes back to the other question, the challenge of cost here. You know, decarbonizing the economy, any economy, is going to come at a cost. It cannot be done as part of a zero-sum game. It just can't. You cannot transition the way we produce and consume energy from where we are today to where we need to get to in 2050 without adding cost. So the cost piece has to be dealt with. But in terms of the overall contribution, the biogas piece, I would question exactly how much it can contribute, but without a shadow of a doubt, it needs to be part of the mix. And I think there is no silver bullet here. There is no silver bullet here. Energy security will always be delivered by a mix of options. And in terms of the renewables piece, Ireland is lucky in a way to have many, many different types of options. How we use them and what contribution they will make to the ultimate mix at the end of the day, I think, is the major challenge for us. And how we fund that or support that. For example, I'm very clear about, in terms of supporting renewables and the need to support renewables, the electricity consumer shouldn't be getting hit for all of the cost of this. Because decarbonisation of the electricity sector is being done because we can't, across Europe, decarbonise other sectors as quickly or as cost effectively. And therefore, we need to look at alternative ways of supporting that transition where it's needed, rather than continuing to lump costs onto the electricity consumer. It needs to be taken from general taxation, from the general rate-paying base, and not continue to load the costs on electricity consumers. I think if we did that with things like biogas, etc., we would see a bit more traction and movement in using that very, very valuable resource that we're simply not tapping at the moment. But absolutely, I would see it as part of the mix, a necessary part of the mix. And going back to Ian's point about being innovative, you know, maybe the wind to gas storage piece is a bit that just might suit what we're doing here in Ireland. You know, it really could. And it's things like that we need to see moving forward. And I have to say, you know, I hope you're wrong, Jerry, about CCS. Because I think even with the best will in the world, we're not suggesting that biomass can fill the entire gap. But without CCS, it's very difficult to see how you get down to that little slice at the end of the roadmap graph. Sometimes when we're having these discussions, and it's very interesting, people don't. It's beautiful looking at pie charts like that, but I mean the amount of energy that sits in behind that has to be replaced or displaced is enormous. I was at a consultation recently with public where we were talking about community energy and generating community energy. It's a wonderful, wonderful concept. If you live in South Kildare or Offaly, where you have space perhaps to grow energy crops or to produce wind, that sort of thing. How does the community here in central Dublin meet its energy needs from a community energy aspect? I have no idea. So sometimes we talk about these concepts, they're beautiful, but when you consider the amount of energy that we have to produce every day and that we consume every day, and with all the best will in the world, energy efficiency is going to take a chunk off that, but it ain't going to be, no more than anything else, it's not going to be the single solution. Most people in this room understand the enormous challenges there are to keeping the lights on every day from an energy perspective. Enormous. Now, transitioning that while keeping the lights on over the next, it is only a matter of 30 odd years. It's an enormous challenge, an enormous challenge.
So just conscious that, John, you've been on your feet there for over an hour, and if there are no more questions, and maybe ask people to maybe continue the discussion. We'll be talking here for the evening, but we'll be in the club later, and maybe other people could raise questions with you out there. So if there are no more questions, any more? I'd like to invite you to take a seat, so John, and we'll
Thanks, Noel.
So look, first of all, apologies to John there. We were a little bit late starting, and again, as Jerry has pointed out, you kicked off on your own. You threw the ball in yourself. But look, in our defence, we were meeting our new Director General, so there were some very interesting discussions there. But apologies for that, John. And look, this lecture this evening was done in conjunction with the Energy Institute and the Cork Region of Engineers Ireland, and there is a group hosted by our Energy and Environment Division committee colleague Paul Dean down in UCC ERI. So thanks to all those guys for convening there. So look, John, we found your talk very, very interesting, and I suppose as members of the audience here have pointed out, Móna is a very respected company, and from an engineering perspective, your time working in the Millpeat area, I know that Móna have designed and engineered a lot of your own machinery, and we can see that tradition of innovation continuing in your presentation here this evening. I found your slide there of a vision for 2030 with 45% wind and 45% fossil fuels, gas and coal. Very interesting, a very interesting slide. And also your vision of building plants that are renewable or support renewable was a very interesting concept. And it shows that Móna as a company, you continue to review your strategy, but you do have a very coherent strategy, and I think you outlined it here for the attendees this evening. So your achievement of generating 1 terawatt-hour of electricity in 2015 is to be commended. You're certainly by no means a minnow in the electricity generating space, and you're to be commended in that. And your efforts and your continuing work in the waste to energy piece, and we've had discussions around that this evening. And I suppose finally, in closing, we'd like to say that you were one of the few people in the last few days that had something positive to say about our Taoiseach over in COP21, and you gave him a vote of confidence there. So look, I'd like to invite the attendees maybe to show our appreciation to John in the usual way. John. So just to close proceedings then, I'd like to thank John for taking the time to come here and present to us this evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming out here to Clyde Road, and our attendees in UCC and indeed online. Our next event, we don't have a
We don't have an evening lecture in January. Our next event will be the first Wednesday in February, and it'll be quite an interesting event. It will be, I suppose, an outturn review of the COP21 process. So it will be broadcast from UCC, and Dr. Brian O'Gallagher, who is actually attending the COP21 conference in Paris, will be presenting on the outturn and indeed some of the implications for Ireland. So that will be broadcast from UCC, but we will be hosting a webcasting of it here in Clyde Road also. So maybe we'd look, if you put that date in your diary, and we'd look forward to seeing you then. So thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and look forward to seeing you at the next event.